Hello, everybody. Welcome to our panel on health and aviation impacted communities. I would like to thank the people that helped chair this panel this year, Dr. Elena Austin with the UW and Jonathan Rathsam with NASA, and myself put this together. I want to just go right in and introduce your first speaker. Dr. Magali Blanco is an environmental health researcher at the University of Washington. Her research focuses on the development of air pollution exposure models for epidemiologic applications. She has a special interest in ultrafine particles, late life cognitive function, and mobile monitoring campaign designs. Her team recently characterized annual average traffic-related air pollution levels, including ultrafine particles, in the greater Seattle area. She is currently investigating the impact of short-term air pollution sampling designs on exposure prediction models and the resulting health inferences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Magali Blanco.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to be talking about ultrafine particles in the greater Seattle area. If you're having issues hearing, some findings and implications for aircraft impacted communities from some of our work. I'm going to be talking about the work that I have worked on with some of my colleagues at the University of Washington, including Elena Austin, Tim Larson, Edmund Cito, and Leanne Shepard, who's the PI of the study. And this research is funded by the National Institutes of Health and the Health Effects Institute. It's going to be a little bit more sciencey, but I'm going to try to keep it a little bit light. So I'm going to start by talking, giving some background on ultrafine particles and health, discuss some of the mobile monitoring that we have done looking at ultrafine particles, talk about some implications for airport impacted communities, and then finish with some of our ongoing work in the area. So I'll start with ultrafine particles. These are not regulated, so there's no standard definition for these. Typically, we define these as particles less than 100 nanometers in diameter. In practice, we often measure particles that are slightly larger. But this image on the right just shows you the relative size of an ultrafine particle. On the bottom, you have the size of a human hair. Those blue, the blue dots that you're seeing, that's the relative size of a PM10. If you look within the red dots you're seeing, that's the relative size of a PM2.5. And more of us may be familiar with these particles. There's a lot more research on these. And then if you look inside of those, inside the little tiny yellow dots, those are the ones at the very top. That's the size of an ultrafine particle. So they're very, very small. There's little organized long-term monitoring of ultrafine particles. So we have very limited data on these, and most of the data that we do have comes from short-term studies. They have a high rate of change and transformation. So they have a high spatial variability. And these come from both primary and secondary sources. Some major known sources of ultrafine particles include diesel combustion. And so this can come from aerial, vehicle, and sea traffic. But wood smoke and photochemical processes are also important. There's increasing evidence that airports are important and dominant sources in many locations of ultrafine particles. We know that aircrafts emit large quantities of ultrafine particles during many different processes. And this is just an example from some of the results of the MOV-UP study around the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, led by Elena Austin. And so what you're seeing here are the relative, so you see the airport is in the center of that map. And then you have these horizontal transects where monitoring was conducted, and the yellow colors, those are indicating where they observed relatively higher, very small ultrafine particles. And so what you're seeing is that when planes are landing from the north, we see higher concentrations right below those landing paths. Whereas if you look further to the south, those concentrations are a lot cooler, indicating lower relative concentrations. And we see the opposite effect when planes are primarily landing from the south, where we have elevated concentrations of these very small particles right below the landing path. So some of this work is really highlighting and really connecting these airplanes to some of these very small particle concentrations. Toxicological and animal studies are indicating that ultrafine particles may be particularly toxic because of their small size. Compared to larger particles, they've shown that they can penetrate deep into the lung, where they can enter the bloodstream and then target other organs. And so that's depicted by the figure on the right. And so you can see that because they're so small, they can become very systemic. And that's different than larger particles, for example, PM 2.5, which is the second image from the left, that just can't reach some of these areas. And there's also evidence that they, compared to larger particles, these very small ultrafine particles lead to increased oxidative stress and inflammation. Human ultrafine particle health data are extremely limited, and this is primarily, again, because we don't have a lot of ultrafine particle data that can be used for epi studies. This table on the right is summarizing some of the what is a summary table from the US EPA Integrated Science Assessment that was published in 2019. They summarize the strength of the evidence by looking at the literature on the health effects of ultrafine particles. And here they're summarizing the literature up through 2018. So what they have found are suggestive effects of respiratory effects, such as asthma, cardiovascular effects like blood pressure and heart rate variability, and nervous system effects like cognitive function. You'll notice that most of these studies are short term, with the exception of nervous system effects, for which we have some studies, longer term studies. There's also some work indicating that children may be especially susceptible to some of these effects. In this report, they found insufficient evidence of other effects, including reproductive, cancer, and mortality outcomes. Since this report was published, new studies have come out since 2018 linking airport-related ultrafine particles to adverse outcomes, including preterm birth and childhood asthma. But in general, we know that there's a need for additional ultrafine particle health studies, particularly in humans, and studies that are long-term. To address this gap, our team conducted a mobile monitoring campaign to measure ultrafine particles, and the goal was to try to support future UFP health studies in this area. Mobile monitoring campaigns are increasingly used to characterize local air pollution levels. There are many, many different designs that are used, so I'll just go through some that are similar to what we did. Typically, you have a vehicle that's equipped with air quality instrumentation. This is what ours look like. You have a vehicle, and then inside we had a lot of air quality instruments. And there's an inlet at the very roof, the very top of the car, and it's collecting. And as we're driving around to these different areas, we're collecting air samples. And so this is just an example of, for example, what our study area was like. You can collect stop measurements, for example, that's represented by those dots. And then campaigns also typically collect data while they're in motion, so while they're driving on the road from area to area. And then typically we use these data to develop exposure assessment models. What our campaign looked like, we're trying to assess annual average ultrafine particle levels in the greater Seattle area. We had 309 stop locations that were representative of a study cohort in the greater Seattle area. Seattle is in the kind of the center part of that area. And our study area also included the SeaTac, or Seattle Tacoma International Airport, which is the largest in the region. At each of these locations, we collected approximately 29 temporally balanced 2-minute samples across an entire year from March of 2019 to 2020 over the course of 285 drive days. So it was a fairly extensive campaign, and we collected measurements during all days of the week and most hours of the day so that we could afterwards use these data to estimate an unbiased annual average. Collected several air pollution measures, including total and size-specific ultrafine particles, as well as other pollutants that are typically considered traffic-related pollutants, like black carbon and nitrogen dioxide. You're seeing here, these are the annual average site concentrations that we get from the data. This is before we do any modeling. So all we've done here is we've collected the data, we've done some quality control, and essentially we've averaged. So right away, you can see that just from our monitoring locations, we're seeing the highest concentrations near the SeaTac airport, along these landing paths from the north, which is how planes most commonly land. and then also some elevated concentrations near this area, near the city center and the Port of Seattle. And everywhere else, the concentrations are relatively much lower. So here, what you're seeing, these are the predicted annual average exposure surfaces. So we use those data in exposure models, and then we can predict throughout the study region to create these smoother surfaces. And so once again, so the red colors, those are indicative of the higher predicted concentrations. And so once again, you see these very high concentrations near the airport, near those landing paths, the city center and the port. And then the models also pick up this very slight increase near highways, but it's very subtle. And when we look at black carbon, the surfaces actually look quite similar. And that's kind of what we expected to see. These pollutants are typically highly correlated. But when we look at this area near the airport and the landing paths, you don't see that same area being highlighted. And when we look at NO2, this is another traffic-related air pollutant. That surface also looks quite different. And that area near the airport, it's not highlighted really at all. So these maps and these initial findings are really just indicating that ultrafines have very unique spatial patterns, and then they're linked to the airport. The other thing that we have started to do is look at ultrafine particles by size and really linking these two sources. So this map that you're seeing on the left here, we're mapping the smaller ultrafine particles, so between 10 and 13 nanometers in diameter. And you can see that there's a spike in concentrations just north of the airport and really not anywhere else. And when we look at just even slightly larger particles, so these are mid-size, just a little bit larger, the surface looks completely different. And we only see a small spike in concentrations here near the vehicle and near the downtown area. So suggesting that possibly these are vehicle or port related. But again, this is still kind of ongoing work. So some implications for airport impacted communities based on some of our work. And then also this is in line with some of the other work in the field. We're seeing that these communities may be exposed to high levels of ultrafine particles, and that total, and this includes total ultrafine particle levels, which come from both roadway traffic as well as aviation sources. And also elevated concentrations of really small ultrafine particles, which from the research we think may be the most toxic. And these are primarily linked to aviation sources. In general, we know that there's a need for more ultrafine particle health studies in airport impacted communities, and we think that these should consider particle size. So finally, I'll end with some of our ongoing work on ultrafine particles. We're currently conducting a study looking at ultrafine particles and dementia incidents. We're doing this in the adult changes in thought cohort. This is a prospective cohort study that's been in the Seattle area since 1994. They follow older participants prospectively until dementia incidents, and participants receive clinic visits every 2 years where they're assessed for cognitive function. To date, we've had over 5,000 participants in the cohort, and we have extensive data on these participants, including medical record, interview, and biological data. So there's a lot that you can do in the cohort. And this is actually the cohort that we modeled our mobile monitoring campaign after. So those locations were specifically selected to monitor at locations that were representative of the residential histories of this cohort. And what we're doing is we're using the residential histories to assess exposure to ultrafine particles, both total and size specific, as well as other pollutants. And then we're running analyses to see if we see a link between ultrafine particle exposures and dementia incidents in this older cohort. We're conducting a similar analysis looking at physical performance in the adult changes in thought cohort, where we're looking at chair stand time, gait speed, and grip strength test. And again, we're linking these to ultrafine particles and traffic pollution exposures. And we're running analyses to see if ultrafine particles or other traffic pollutants are associated with baseline physical performance. So do people that have higher concentrations of ultrafine particles when they're coming in, do they have lower physical performance? And then also, do they decline quicker over time as we follow them? We have a couple studies where we're looking at ultrafine particle exposure assessment. One, we're looking at the impact of mobile monitoring design on ultrafine particle exposure models and the subsequent health impacts. So this study is really looking at the importance of monitoring design if your goal is to collect data that's later going to be used in an EPI study. And for this, we're doing a case study looking at cognitive function again in the ACH cohort and ultrafine particles. We're also working to develop modeling covariates to improve the predictions near airports. We've seen from our own work that traditional regression assessment methods can produce large errors in these areas. So we're developing methods and covariates that hopefully will be translatable to other locations, not just the greater Seattle area. Finally, I'd like to thank our research team. Leanne Shepard is the principal investigator of these studies. I'm a postdoc working under her, and Elena Austin, Tim Larson, and Edmund Cedar are also part of our research team. And again, we're funded by NIH and the Health Effects Institute.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you, Magali. I'd next like to introduce Dr. Kris Johnson. She is a senior social research scientist with Seattle and King County Public Health Assessment. She works with policy development and evaluation in that division. Dr. Johnson's work summarizes the available literature review on the health status of people living within 10 miles of SeaTac International Airport. Dr. Johnson.
I appreciate the time to talk with you all and have learned a lot from you. So thank you also for that. This work was completed in 2020, and we were asked by the Washington State Legislature, we were mandated actually in part of a budget bill, an approved bill, to look at the community health within a 10-mile radius, and then also conduct a literature review, as Debbie mentioned, that included a strength of evidence analyses, that included also a review of the MOV-UP study that Dr. Blanco spoke to, and then make some recommendations to how best to address these health issues. The geography for looking at community health was part of the mandate. And so you can see the geographies on the screen. We were asked to look at community health within a 1-mile radius of SeaTac, a 1 to 5 mile radius, and then a 5 to 10 mile radius. My guess is these geographies were based on prior studies, including one done by Dr. Hutta, who you will hear from. It's important for us to realize that this is not in any way a causal analysis. There are a number of other sources of pollutants in this area, 2 highways, the King County Municipal Airport, the Boeing Airfield, and we're looking just at what is happening with community health. It's a descriptive analysis. We can't even look at causes in the way that we did the analyses. I'm relatively new to the area and was very new at the area in 2020. And one of the things that surprised me was that this airport community region, which I'm going to refer to that 10-mile area from now on as airport communities, this area is home to the majority of King County's people of color. So the majority of our 2.3 million residents reside in this area. You've got roughly 75% of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander residents, almost 75% of Black and African American residents, more than half of our Hispanic and Latino populations. Compared to the rest of King County, this area also has a higher percentage of children and a higher percentage of immigrants. So again, we wanted to look at what is the health of airport communities compared to the rest of King County. Overall, the finding is that residents in airport communities face disparities in health risk factors, and resources. For some measures, health outcomes were worse the closer one is to the airport. For example, hospital rates for heart disease, the rate of death across causes, and life expectancy. So for example, if you are within 1 mile of SeaTac Airport, your life expectancy is 5 years lower than the rest of King County. If you're within that 5 to 10 mile range, your life expectancy was 1.7 years lower than the rest of King counties. One of the other key findings for me is that the health disparities that we're talking about occur across the life course. And so I want to run you quickly through some examples. And when you get access to the slide presentation, there's links to the report and other resources. So overall, mothers in airport communities were 43% more likely to have a premature birth than the rest of the county. And what you see, that highest bar on the left is the data for the 1 mile radius, and then the 1 to 5 mile radius, 5 to 10 mile radius, and then the rightmost bar is the percentage for the rest of King County. Not shown on the slide, but worth mentioning is there were also significant differences in airport communities. Mothers were more likely to have low birth weight infants born to them, and less likely to have received adequate prenatal care. Airport communities have twice as many children living in poverty or near poverty, using the federal poverty level definition, than were the rest of King County. This is also true of adults. Adults are more likely to be uninsured in airport communities compared to the rest of the county, and also more likely in the behavioral risk surveillance survey that's done nationwide to report not receiving necessary medical care because they could not afford it. Airport communities have a higher rate of hospitalization across a number of outcomes, including heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. They were also more likely to have a higher rate of hospitalization for asthma in the 1 to 5 mile area and the 5 to 10 mile area. And then, as I mentioned, airport communities have a higher rate of death than the rest of King County, a higher rate of death from heart disease, a higher rate of death from diabetes, and a higher rate of death, interestingly, from accidental injuries. So again, we're talking about a population that has health conditions that increase their risk when exposed to pollutants. For example, when I have asthma and I'm exposed to air pollution, I am more likely then to have an acute asthmatic attack and develop chronic pulmonary disorder, COPD. So our next ask was to review the literature. When we looked at the existing literature and conducted a strength of evidence analyses, we borrowed from the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA's methods in doing that strength of evidence analysis. And I can describe it in more depth if folks are interested in it. And the report goes into a great deal of depth. So in general, we're talking, what you see on the slide are the conditions and exposures that have a likely causal relationship or a causal relationship. A causal relationship means multiple studies, and most other explanations have been ruled out. And we're talking, and there's evidence that the biological pathway is substantiated. And then co-pollutants have been explained. Likely causal means you've got a significant number of strong studies. There may be some question around co-pollutants. And then biological pathways are plausible, but there may not be, for example, as Dr. Blanco mentioned, there may not be the animal studies in the number that we want to guarantee that biological pathway is explained. So we know, for example, that noise pollution can cause hypertension and heart disease. That's a causal relationship based on our review of the literature. Poor school performance is a likely outcome of significant noise pollution exposures. The air pollutants that we're talking about coming from airport exhaust, but also ground traffic, are across a number of sources, and Dr. Blanco mentioned a few of them. And what we see from the body of air pollutants, including the particulate matter, the nitrous dioxide, sulfur oxides, the hazardous air pollutants, ozone, we're looking at a causal relationship with respiratory issues, primarily asthma and respiratory diseases like COPD. We've got a causal relationship to cardiovascular issues, hypertension, heart disease, and stroke. The ozone in particular has an impact on the nervous system, mostly dementia and oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is a condition that compromises our ability to fight pathogens, is the short explanation. Metabolic issues, including diabetes. And then most recently, especially for PM 2.5, there's a likely causal relationship with reproductive health concerns, the preterm births that I mentioned. We do need to know more about how much exposure leads to some of these health conditions. But we know enough to start thinking about what we can do to mitigate some of these harms to health. And in particular, in our local region, in the Seattle-King County area, we've got a 2018 Beacon Hill study that was based on citizen science that established that we've got noise levels over the recommended levels for our health. The Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, which is an independent community-based organization, looked at particulate matter and found that especially in the winter, our particulate matter levels are over EPA recommendations. And then as Dr. Austin talked about yesterday and Dr. Blanco today, we've learned a lot from the MOV-UP team study about ultrafine particulate matters, including that they come from both airline activities as well as ground traffic, that we can separate what comes from airplane exhaust compared to what comes from ground traffic. And then it's been fascinating to stay in touch and learn that air pollution concentrations inside schools within airport communities are sometimes as high as what is the outside concentration, and that portable HEPA air purifier units in the classroom can significantly improve our air quality in those spaces. So, in conclusion, I want to make a couple of points about cumulative impact and effect. So airport community residents are more likely to have health conditions that increase our risk of adverse effects. So for example, here on the screen, you see an analysis of asthma diagnoses by zip code using Washington all-payer claims data, which covers about 70% of our people on healthcare. The same pattern is true for residents with asthma and above average use of acute care. And I'm asking you to trust me. I'm not showing you the whole county on the slide, but again, in the notes, you can go to the actual visualizations and see that I am not misinterpreting, that the rest of the county does have a lower risk and a lower prevalence. And then airport community residents, as I ran through some of the other data points you might have gathered, are more likely to face social vulnerabilities than are the rest of the county. And this is true using a social vulnerability index that county staff developed during COVID, during the pandemic. And the number of people who are at risk using demographics, employment data, and the like are significantly higher than in the rest of the county. This leads to the resource disparities, or contributes to the resource disparities that I mentioned. So adults living in South King County are more likely to experience food insecurity, meaning not having enough food and not having enough resources to get more, as well as other disparities. And so what you see here on the slide is the percentage of families expressing that they didn't have enough food to last and could not get more. These cumulative effects have some systemic roots that are important for us to think about. So residents in this area are more likely to be exposed to air pollution, more likely to have health conditions that increase their risk, more likely to have health disparities. They are also more likely to have faced systemic discrimination, as for example, the figures that you see on the right are from a Seattle Times article that links you to a study that confirmed that people living in a region that faced redlining, which is a form in housing of discrimination by race. So neighborhoods where primarily people of color resided were often graded lower and valued less than areas where white people lived. And so historic redlining in the Seattle area is also linked to higher air pollution exposures. We also know that chronic discrimination or regularly facing discrimination also has a health impact. We know that facing microaggressions and discrimination leads to hypertension and other heart conditions, as well as depression and anxiety. So these cumulative effects, in my mind, increase our responsibility to take action, because one of the things we can do is work on health equity in these regions. So our recommendations were very general, and I'm here representing a team, and thank you for that team. So our recommendations were general because it's going to take us working at multiple levels, state, county, and federal, in order to improve health equity and protect the health of these community residents. So we recommend addressing the health disparities of airport communities in a number of ways, including HEPA air filters. There's a project in Seattle working to improve education and awareness among pregnant families. For example, we also recommend that we continue to mitigate and improve the health rate and to mitigate the health impacts of airport operations, again, with home insulation and the HEPA portable air filter units. We recommended continuing the development and implementation of strategies to mitigate airport-related air and noise pollution. So keep studying what else we can do. Implementing new technologies as we learn about them to improve measurement, right? Systemically measuring air and noise pollution, both indoors and outdoors. Expanding, so we talked about the monitoring, but also the new technologies, and then generally speaking, to support research that addresses our gaps in knowledge.
Thank you so much, Kris, for your wonderful presentation. Next, we have, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sonja Jeram. She is a biologist involved in the environmental noise and health since 2008 within the European project ANIMA. She was part of the team reviewing the literature on aviation noise and health effects. She participated in the case study with mobile application developed within this project to assess the reactions of citizens on aviation noise following an establishment of the dialogue forum for the airport at Ljubljana. Join me in welcoming Dr. Jeram.
Thank you. I would like to thank especially to Jonathan Rathsam and Sandra Hall for making it possible for me to be here. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. It would be probably more ecological to stay at home, but it's so nice to meet new people. So I really enjoyed the meeting. Very happy to be here. I was involved in the ANIMA project, and we have developed a mobile application to check for the response of population about the aviation noise. And we did that in the COVID time. So you can imagine that we don't have results about that. So I will, I will talk about the literature search that we did in a team, and here are the colleagues that we were working together, evaluating the health effects of aviation noise and also effects on well-being. So that is, I think, very important. First of all, I will say a few words about the ANIMA project, then about the effects of aircraft noise, limitations of the studies, and then the most important conclusions that we have. The ANIMA project was in part focused on annoyance and sleep disturbance. It was focused on communities. The very important part of it was to consider non-acoustic factors. And we had some tools, mobile apps, and audio-visual simulations also that we think could be useful for spatial planners, policymakers, or researchers. And we assume that reducing noise levels alone is not enough to decrease noise annoyance. And annoyance is important. You will see later, I will explain it. It's very important engaging the communities to improve their well-being and quality of life. They have to be heard. They have to know that we understand the difficulties that they find themselves in. So we were talking a lot to communities. With this picture, I just want to illustrate that how interesting it is, how we perceive the noise differently in different situations. And if we are in such situation that we see the traffic, it's a different response than it would be in such situation if we have a questionnaire, and it's a personal opinion about how we perceive the noise. And then about the health outcomes, so we are all familiar with WHO report from 2018. And that report includes the literature until 2014. So our aim was to check the literature after then, after 2014 until 2018, and then 19 as well. And we focused on annoyance and sleep disturbance, but in the literature review, we reviewed all possible effects on health and well-being. In the meantime, there were other groups doing also reviews, and there is a new review on sleep disturbance and probably ongoing studies and ongoing reviews. But what we found was that none of the results changed the guidelines of the WHO. So it's from 2019. As I said, there are new studies going on, new publications that I didn't take into consideration for this presentation. So sleep disturbance is very important because it causes, from aviation noise, because it causes a high burden of disease, also including other traffic sources, of course. The burden of disease is even bigger. So a lot of people are exposed to noise that is disturbing health. And it's very important that we consider different disturbances, like difficulty to fall asleep, how long we sleep, how well we sleep, and the awakenings seem to be very, very important. And then, as we already heard, the number of noise events and maximal levels are very important to consider, additional to DNL. And not only the number of events, but also the time when they appear, early in the morning, late in the evening, during the night. The nighttime was considered to be very important. And then noise annoyance. It's important for noise annoyance that it's not just an outcome. It has an important role also in leading to other diseases. It actually facilitates the appearance of other diseases, and that's why it's also in the focus of our project. And with this picture, I think I sum up the whole idea of our work in Anima project. We have acute short-term effects from aviation noise. We have long-term effects on the other side, and you see that you have annoyance and sleep disturbance in both sides. And on the right side, you have cardiovascular diseases that I think are crucial and the most important. And in between, we have non-acoustic factors, stress as a mechanism, and then coping. How good are we in coping with the stress from aviation noise? And it's important that, again, we have sleep disturbance and annoyance in between, as a mediators. And as already Kris mentioned, if you already have a disease, you will probably react differently on exposure, on noise or particles. And that is also important, that we have different vulnerable populations, and especially children, elderly, or already people with some illness. Cardiovascular disease, of course, in the focus of our work all the time, and it's very important to consider not only aviation noise, also other sources of noise, and also other sources and causes of cardiovascular disease. And the particles are here, of course, today already mentioned. So we have to think about the additional effects or even synergistic effects. Metabolic disease, they are caused by noise, but we don't have a lot of studies that would show that the aviation noise is causing this, but probably there is only a lack of studies. Children health. For children, we know the study, the range study, and schools close to the airports, and the difficulties in reading skills and oral comprehension. In this point of my presentation, I would like to mention the new European project that I'm involved in, Equal Life. Equal Life is one of 9 European projects ongoing that has in its title or in its description the word exposome. And exposome is, at least in part, what Kris presented when we consider physical exposure and social exposure, different kind of physical exposure, negative and positive, and also the internal biomarkers. We only exclude the genome. It's a very, very complex approach. We have access to several cohort studies, and we are trying to find out how different exposures affect children in different ages from the birth until 21. And the outcomes that we are most interested are health, mental health, and cognitive development. And to make the picture even more complicated, we have the mediators like coping, stress, and sleeping. So we will see, we have 1 more year and a half, and it's not an easy task, but it's good at least to know that there is more about it, not only what we study. And mental health, I already mentioned. Of course, mental health is very important also in children, the behavior that we study in this project that I mentioned, but also annoyance can be a mediator so that the mental problems would develop later. Hearing impairment is not an issue in aviation noise today. We heard how much the noise of one plane has reduced in last several 20, 30, 40 years, I don't know. It's really incredible, but still the number of planes are big. And if you live close to the airport, still the individual overflights may be very loud. So we shouldn't neglect that. And when very small children are exposed, we don't know what happens to the hearing system. And then also the long-term morbidity. We have not enough studies to follow what happens to the children that were close to the airport the whole life. And of course, any epidemiological study has a limitation. It's so difficult to really plan a perfect study. And even when you finish the study, you usually see that you missed something. And here are a few categories that we would expose: what is the study design, how we participate, select the participants, how we characterize the outcome. I mentioned, for example, for sleep disturbance, it's the same for other outcomes, that you have to be very precise. Exposure assessment, we absolutely need more indicators, more different ways how we evaluate the noise in the study. And then, of course, there are confounding factors. Lifestyle is important, social economic issues, so on. And then to conclude with a really very, very short summary, the research findings are still inconclusive and new studies of high quality are needed, of course, always. But I think we have enough pieces of the whole picture that we know that we have an issue below 65. And we have to do something about it. It doesn't really matter if the legislation is there or not. It's good to be to the precautionary principle. And then, yeah, I would also say that nighttime exposure is very important for the causing of cardiovascular disease. We were not so aware about that before. Noise and sleep disturbance are the mediators, so it's really important to take it seriously. We cannot neglect annoyance and sleep disturbance as not being a disease. This is part of the definition of WHO, and we have to take it seriously. Non-acoustic factors are very important, and among them, I would say that trust is one of the factors on the top of the list. And of course, experiences, expectations, there are several. And to achieve that, we need transparent information policy and community engagement, usually also using the process of mediation. It's a good example of Vienna Airport. And I will finish my presentation with this illustration, which is a work of children from our schools that were engaged in the international competition on the Noise Awareness Days. So it's a big pleasure for me to work with schools, kindergartens, and I think that they deserve better and supportive environment as far as we can guarantee that for them. They really, yeah, that's the main message, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonja, for your wonderful presentation. And next we have Dr. Nilakshi Huda. She is Research Assistant Professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Tufts University. She has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering, a master's in environmental management and negotiations, and PhD in environmental engineering. Dr. Huda has over 15 years of research experience in urban air pollution with a particular focus on transportation origin emissions and ultrafine particulate matter. Her seminal work on the long downwind spatial range of the impacts of aviation emissions on ultrafine particles is recognized for its implications for the health of millions who reside near airports. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Huda.
Research I'll present today has implications for large populations that live near airports. About 10% of US population lives within 10 miles of the top 23 airports, which I defined as airports that have at least 10 million enplanements, which is a large number. In contrast, does anybody want to guess what CDC considers as the fraction of US population that lives near major roadways? About 4%. That sort of puts this into perspective. And that's one of the motivations for me and my research. Adverse health conditions, as you've heard today, are prevalent at higher incident rates in near airport communities. There's a whole host of literature documenting that. The widest body of literature is on hypertension and cardiovascular disease incidents. Lately, adverse learning outcomes in children and preterm birth and brain cancer, which is what I'll focus on. This is the work that was done near LAX. And there are many ways to do these works. You can correlate the health outcomes with elevated levels of noise or air pollution, or just simply proximity, whether you live within a certain mile of the airport or not, which is what Dr. Johnson presented today. There are many ways of conducting these health studies, and I'll cover several of them that have different approaches today. I'll go over what ultrafine particles are and airplane exhaust a little bit, since it's been covered already in an earlier presentation. I'll talk to you about some results from Boston and Los Angeles and summarize how we characterize the air pollution around these airports. If I have time, I'll talk a little bit about Schiphol and Berlin, and then summarize some of the health effect investigations. A decade of work has gone on at LAX, which has now started to result in some health effect studies. I'll summarize those for you. And maybe if time permits, I'll share a few things that I'm excited about for the future. So ultrafine particles, they're an excellent marker of combustion. Right? We count them, we usually report them on number basis. Like you'll hear like thousands of particles per centimeter cube. Centimeter cube is like a sugar cube, those old fashioned sugar cubes that you put in tea. So they're very small particles. You can fit a lot of them in a small space. They're not the only thing that comes out of an airplane exhaust. It's a complex mixture. And communities near airports are exposed to that complex mixture. Health effects are an outcome of that complex mixture. So you may wonder, like, why are we so focused on ultrafine particles? So to me, there are two good reasons for that. One, ultrafine particles itself are associated with certain health effects. Two, I need a really good proxy or a marker of jet plane emissions that I can measure easily, accurately, and with confidence, and I can attribute specifically to airplane exhaust. And ultrafine particles are really good at that. They're emitted in high number by jet particles. There are a couple of questions that need to be answered before a health investigation can start. One of them is, what is the spatial extent of the impact? Which is essentially me drawing my study domain or a line around an airport and figuring out who exactly is impacted. What is the spatial extent of the impact? Second question is, what is the impact itself? We want to characterize it. We want to quantify it. We eventually want to have an exposure assessment. Exactly what is that number that people are exposed to within that impact zone? So these, quite simply put, these are like who is exposed and to how much. And it's a simple way of putting it, but it's $1 million of effort and a decade of effort that goes into answering these simple questions. And the answers could be very different, and the approach that we have to take could be very situation specific. What is the spatial extent of the impact is one of the questions that we started answering way back at LAX 10 years ago. And answering this question requires sorting out the impacts from confounding sources. Airports, of course, don't exist in isolation. There's an entire transportation infrastructure that surrounds them. And we need to differentiate those impacts. What's coming from highways, what's coming from the airports. And in 2012, an opportunity presented itself. For those of us who are from Southern California, spent time there, might recall Carmageddon. So 405 was shut down near LAX, right? Big source of air pollution. And that was a great opportunity for us back when I was a graduate student to go out and make measurements, because this big confounding factor right next to LAX 405 shut down for adding another lane. Airports were operating as usual. And because there was good public announcement, there were no cars on the road that day. It was termed Carmageddon. So great opportunity. We were able to now pick up a really clear signal from what's LAX, and then we kept on doing it. And eventually we found that the impact sort of extends much farther than anyone had at that point determined or suspected. We were able to make measurements all the way up to around 16 kilometers or 10 miles away from the airport and still detect at least a twofold increase in concentration under the landing jet trajectories, which align to the direction of the runways and also the direction of prevalent wind. So whatever's produced there gets advected downwind. And therefore you see this Gaussian pattern here. This research was published in 2014 and followed up in 2016 with this idea of what exactly is the size distribution of those ultrafine particles, and is there anything really specific about them that lets me fingerprint this sort of ultrafine particle from the ultrafine particles that I get from highways. And it turns out, yes, there is a sort of a fingerprint signature there. And these ultrafine particles that are from the airports tend to be much smaller than what we get from diesel engines or gasoline engines or from highways. Another factor that needs to be considered, as I mentioned, when we're trying to figure out what is the spatial extent of the impact or who's impacted, is wind direction. Wind direction sort of also dictates the runway utilization. And LAX is a very atypical example of that. Look at the constancy of wind there, which means as the wind blows from one direction, there's only community that's downwind along that direction is the community that's overwhelmingly impacted. And most of the time, they are the ones that are impacted. Atlanta sort of midway, but once we go to Boston or Chicago, it gets really complicated because the wind moves from all the directions. The runway configurations switch. Sometimes at Logan, they switch the operational configuration 3 times in an hour. So it gets really complicated trying to chase the impact and figure out who's getting impacted and by how much. And then it gets really technically complicated. And this is what we do in Boston these days. The second question is, what is the impact of characterizing it? It similarly needs, the confounding factors are similar. We need to differentiate what's everything else contributing versus what aircrafts are contributing. To do that, we need to make representative measurements and then eventually do robust modeling. And what do I mean by representative measurements? We know that there are certain factors that make a difference. Seasons make a difference, meteorology makes a difference, terrain makes a difference. There's intra-annual variation. And when COVID happens, flight activity all of a sudden drops by 70%. So we try to make measurements that encompass all the factors that we know are going to make a difference in the concentrations, try to capture that variation to the best of our abilities, and then come up with a robust data set that can be modeled. There are many ways of actually doing this. And one of the approaches we use in Boston is initially we tried to look at data from stationary sites. And the LAX work was done with a mobile monitoring approach, which I'll show later. But we found that as far as 6.5 kilometers away or 7.3 kilometers away, pardon my use of metric units, I'm from the engineering system. We found that the highest concentrations at these locations were when wind was from the direction of the airport as that far away. You can look at a community that's really up close to the airport, like Chelsea here. Again, same pattern. When the wind is from the direction of the airport, we get the highest concentrations. We collect this data long term, and then we can sort of quantify. So for example, when COVID happened and the flight activity went down by 70%, we were able to quantify that the corresponding ultrafine particle concentrations at a stationary site where we have years and years of data were down by 40%. Another factor that needs to be considered at that given location is, at any given location, is that what are the planes doing? And that makes a huge amount of difference whether at the nearest runway, the planes are taking off versus the planes are landing. So here's an example of a house located in Winthrop, Massachusetts, which is only about 1.6 kilometers away from the airport, really close to a runway. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a laser, or it does, but I don't know how to operate it. So, under the gray bars is when the planes are taking off at the nearest runway. And the orange highlighted area is when the planes are landing overhead. And it can make tenfold of a difference in concentrations, even at a given location. So that's another factor we take into consideration when we are designing studies, is what is the runway, what are the flight configurations, what are they doing? And then we also try to get the flight data to the best of our ability and correlate that with concentrations and in the models. Here's a picture of our mobile monitoring lab. This is our latest version that I use at Tufts. I had used something similar at USC when we did the LAX work. This is the inside of a mobile lab on the lower side, which is a much more older edition where we had a lot more space. The instruments have sort of improved. We have the state-of-the-art version now. So you can fit a lot of things in a small electric car. But the idea is that the mobile lab is mobile. So it allows us to move really fast and chase the impact where it is and quantify it really quickly within the few hours that the wind is blowing from a certain direction. We can cover the area, make mobile measurements, and figure out what the impacts are on the ground. So this is an approach that we sometimes employ in tandem with stationary monitoring long-term to fill up the gaps in space. So using these approaches, back in LAX, we started doing this work about 10 years ago. And in the last few years, we've been able to take that work up to a stage where we have a model, and then we are able to apply that model to get to exposure assessment and look at health effects. And here's one of the first papers that was published on that, which looked at preterm birth outcomes or preterm birth rates amongst mothers that were exposed to ultrafine particles from jet exhaust. And I should mention that we specifically looked at ultrafine particles that we think were coming from jet exhaust and not the ultrafine particles that are always present in the background ambient air, because cars emit ultrafine particles and there are a whole bunch of other sources. Looks at specifically account for what's coming from the airplanes. And we found that there was about a 32% higher rate of preterm birth incidence amongst those people who were really close to the airport, had the highest 25% of exposure versus the lowest 25% of exposure. So the red versus the darker purple that you see here. And 3-minute warning. All right, so, and then we accounted for socioeconomic status as well. And we still found that there's at least a 14% higher risk of preterm birth in those that are exposed to really high pollutions near LAX. Here's my wonderful research team, and it does take a lot of expertise and experience to conduct this work. Similar models were then applied to look at brain cancer incident rates at LAX. We found that, actually I shouldn't say I wasn't a co-author in this, but there was an increased odds ratio again for brain cancer, and the highest odds ratio increase was for African-American population, which in this case also turns out that they live closest to the airport because those are the demographics near LAX. We then specifically looked at traffic-related air pollution and airport noise, because we know that, as I said, airports don't exist in isolation. We are exposed to a lot of things altogether. Health effects are cumulative, exposure is cumulative. But the effects are synergistic. This is what this paper reported, wherein we looked at who are the people that are exposed to the highest noise and who are the people who are exposed to the highest air pollution from traffic. And those were the people that had the worst outcomes. Here's another set of study that I think is commendable and worth mentioning. It was conducted near Schiphol Airport, and they looked at health in 3 ways. Health outcomes through observational studies, through what's called controlled exposure, and then 1 minute. So here they found that the positive results were in the controlled exposure, where people were put in a controlled exposure chamber exposed to the airport aerosol, airport-related emissions in this control chamber, and they found that there were positive health effects, as in like positive association between exposure and negative health effects, adverse health effects. This is another set of studies that I'm excited about, that if you're going to the AEC conference in 2 weeks, you might hear from. In Berlin, they closed down an airport and they moved the airport to another location. So that is an excellent, unique opportunity for those of us who are interested in studying health effects, because all of a sudden exposure goes away one place and starts another place. It's so the BEAR study results, they looked at about 800 children in several schools, and they look at those outcomes. These results will be presented at the conference in 2 weeks if you're heading there. And that's not the only sort of way we can do these neat experimental designs of health studies around airports. We often see that airports are expanded. That's another opportunity to study these health effects or characterize what impact an expansion might have on the air quality. Or runway shutdowns. I know they're shutting down one runway to do some work for 100 days in Logan. So that's another opportunity for us to quantify what happens if you shut down a runway. Future work that I'm excited about. What is the most efficient way to characterize aircraft emissions impacts on ground level? I mean, a decade of work has gone into LAX and it's not perfect, can be improved. But if we have to do this at many airports, what is the efficient strategy to characterize these airport impacts? And we are working on that in Logan, in Boston. We have also started to use drones in our work, which I think is very exciting. And 2 more points that I'll mention is that the chemical composition of particles and toxicology remains unstudied, except for perhaps very near field around airports. And that seems to be something that's important and should be studied further and further away. What exactly is the chemical constituents in this ultrafine mix? And lastly, ending on a hopeful note, maybe I'll come back in 2030 or 2050 and talk to you about what changes have resulted from the changing fuel mix, newer standards, and a shift to SAF. That would be very interesting to study.
All right, so thank you to our fantastic panel today for really trying to give us the state of the art on our understanding of the relationship between exposures to UFP, noise, and health. And now we'll move into a Q&A, and some of the questions will be for specific panelists and some will be for the panel as a whole. So I think the first question we have is for Dr. Blanco, and it's really a question about costs. And so the question is, what would be the costs for doing a similar ultrafine campaign study? And what would you suggest for communities or groups that are interested in supporting and pursuing similar projects?
Thank you. Elena, actually, you might be able to help me out with some of the budgetary questions. But I will say, sorry, let me push this back a little. I will say that they're very expensive. And a lot of that comes from personnel time. Instruments are also fairly expensive. We have instruments at this point that we share at the UW, so that kind of cuts things back. I helped with the design of the mobile monitoring campaign in terms of developing the protocols, where we were going to be monitoring, looking at the cohort that we were interested in. So that also helped. That was part of my doctoral work. But at this point, we have a lot of those protocols set up, and we're actually hoping to redo that mobile monitoring campaign in the next few years to really try to develop some really long-term exposure surfaces that we can use in long-term EPI studies.
And I think we'll ask the same question to Dr. Huda. Yes.
These kind of studies can cost somewhere between several $100,000 for a seasonal or a 1-year-long campaign to, if you want to fully characterize an airport, you're looking at $1 million of expenses. But so that's where the work comes in. What is the efficient way to characterize it? The question that I'd probably, I'll ask the community group, what exactly is it that they want to accomplish through the monitoring, and do they really need to do it? Can they just ask another researcher to come in and spend their time and do it? I would not recommend a community group investing in this because it's extremely expensive. Neither would I recommend a community group to do something that's really low cost sensor, because the data can be very questionable, and what you save upfront in capital costs, you actually spend in labor in trying to analyzing and correcting that data. So my recommendation would be to find a university partner and conduct the work through them.
I actually have another comment. Thank you. So our team is actually also working on, we have several studies where we're looking at design, and part of that is looking at how much can we cut data, how much less data can we collect, and still develop good exposure models that will give us good health estimates. So that's one thing that we're actually working on, and that should hopefully reduce the cost, which is pretty large. And so we're excited we have a couple papers out, and we have another one that hopefully will be published soon, where we're actually looking at the impact of how much data do you collect, when do you collect it, how does that impact your exposure models, and then following it through to the health piece, how that impacts your results. And so we have recommendations, like standard recommendations for some of the sampling techniques that we think campaigns should be using if they're interested in collecting these data to apply to health studies down the road.
All right, thank you. The next question is for Dr. Kris Johnson. And it's, were you able to compare the data from airport communities with similar demographic portions of Seattle rather than the rest of Seattle in terms of their demographics?
We did not compare within Seattle. We stuck to the task. The budget was, we actually went over budget. So we concentrated on making sure that we could do what we were asked, and so compared within King County. But the data are certainly available, similar to others, you know, where we transparent about what we're doing, and we've been actively recruiting graduate students to help. So the health data that we have and the census tract, that defined the geographies and the zip codes that defined those geographies, we're willing to share with grad students and anyone else who wants to do those comparisons.
The next question is for Dr. Jeram, and it's, can you provide a recommendation on the number of events and specific noise levels that identify problem levels and or suggest literature that does? So not to put you on the spot.
I think I've heard one such recommendation yesterday. It was like 50 events, and yeah, I'm okay with that. But I don't know the literature that would explicitly say this is.
Okay, so here's a kind of a spatial question on UFPs I think we'll address to Dr. Huda and Dr. Blanco. And it's a question about how the UFP move and whether they're found in the wake of engines as they sit in gates or as they're taxiing, and how can we disentangle those activities and UFP exposures.
The whole talk or a whole day of conversation. But the answer is yes. Anytime you burn fuel, you're creating ultrafine particles, which is what makes it extremely complicated to entangle what's getting, and taxiing is burning Jet A, landings are burning Jet A, takeoffs are burning Jet A, of course, at different thrust levels. So maybe organic component is a little different. But this really gets into the weed wherein you can't just solve this with just a number count, but you also got to look at the composition and size distribution and how that varies in different LTO cycles, and then we can start to untangle. The other way of doing it, maybe a sort of more efficient approach, would be to set up monitoring at places where only certain type of activities take place, depending on which way the wind is blowing. Sometimes some airports operate, they try to get all the planes off the ground first and then take in the landing. So that way, if you time your study well or measurements well, you can try to differentiate the two. But it's a complicated question. It's definitely doable, and we are trying to do it in Boston through a whole network of sites and mobile monitoring. But it is, as now, remains unanswered.
All right, so the next question is also about UFPs, and the question is, are there indicators of UFPs in blood, or I guess biological samples? And is this an area that you can comment on, as well as is there a correlation that you have been interested in between those biological indicators and numbers of flights?
There are some studies actually showing that because ultrafine particles are so small, like one of those images that I showed, that they can, typically the smaller the particle is, the deeper in the lung they are deposited. And because ultrafine particles are so small, they can actually go into the blood and then target other organs. And there are actually some autopsy studies, particularly in Mexico, really showing that they actually, because the particles are so small, they can actually be inhaled and be deposited directly into the brain. And they have shown, there have been some studies where they can physically see particles in the brain. So they are seeing them.
If someone's pressing really hard to find a blood biomarker, I would say anything that represents inflammation, probably going to be a good starting point for ultrafine particles that are known to cause systemic inflammation. It's also true that there have been studies that have documented certain types of ultrafine particles that are particularly associated with traffic emissions, and there's a marker for that, a certain sort of ferrous magnetite that has been found in the deposited in the brain, and that has been specifically linked to what comes from these certain automobile emissions.
And this is a question for everyone on the panel. And it's how will this research or future research help inform local policy decisions on healthcare, learning, and what kind of funding might be needed for uninsured in these areas?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. It's an excellent question and it's really important. I personally would advocate for more research on interventions. I think if we want to get more funding to improve and protect population health in these communities, we need to be able to talk about it and we need evidence to show that it's effective. For example, I remember in 2020 when I was looking at the evidence about air filtration in homes, a lot of the studies that I looked at, people were opening windows. And so those studies weren't able to say very strongly that yes, filtering air using HEPA filters will help improve air quality, and then that will improve short-term health. So I would advocate that we need intervention studies, and I think those could be funded in a number of ways. I confess, since you're here, FAA, I was really hoping that the federal improvement projects would cover community health rather than airport operations, or at least be extended to that. So I think FAA project money could be used. I'd like to see CDC and NIH fund more efforts. I think we could also look at foundations. I think we all are aware of our funding situation nationwide. So maybe we also need to ask foundations to help us.
Environmental engineer and somebody who has training in like freight and transport, I sort of look at solutions in two bins, sort of like the source side and then the receptor side. And source side controls would mean what can the airports do to reduce their emissions in the first place. And then there's sort of receptor side, sort of the interventions that can happen or sort of mitigations that can happen at the residents that are the receptors. So for sound mitigation, soundproofing is a good example of that happens on the receptor side. So we could consider controls and interventions like that. But I think once there's recognition that these ultrafine particles are there, they have health effects, they're just not on the outside air, but they get indoors. I think it's sort of a more communal effort in us all recognizing that we can build our homes or buildings better in the first place and try to keep what's outdoor air pollution outdoors and create better indoor, healthier spaces. Now, who pays for that and how that comes about, what kind of local zoning policies there are about putting maybe sensitive schools or old age homes near airports. So I think it's a very complex question, which has to have lots of stakeholders on the table for it, from land use planners to policymakers to community. And certainly there are lots of solutions that can happen in the space as is, which is just smart planning.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your wonderful presentations. Thank you for the great work that you do. We're honored and privileged to have your presence here, some coming from halfway around the world. So I want to just thank you so much.